War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to Episode 9, Land Warfare Part 3, The Psychology of Close Combat. My intent of land warfare was a single episode, and then two, and this was to be the finale, explaining in more detail the concept of fires. However, to explain the concept of fires outside an understanding of close combat would leave too much unexplained. The context of hand-to-hand must be understood before fires can be explained properly. I hope to keep the upcoming episodes on air power and sea power to one each. Much of what we have covered also applies. Also, those will focus on the strategy of both with but a brief once-over on basic tactics at sea and in the air because, while familiar with the strategies, I admittedly have but scant knowledge of the actual nuts and bolts of the tactics. Later, I hope to have fighter pilots and surface warfare experts join us to help explain it to us all. But now, to the origins of conflict. Since before the age of Homo sapiens, our prehistoric ancestors fought, with fists and teeth at first. Brutal primal combat, hand-to-hand. I suspect that the combat was rarely fatal, as the defeated foe most likely retreated, leaving the victor the battlefield and whatever spoils to be had. Water, food, females, shelter. Only what was given by God was our weapons, and they required close contact with our enemy. As our brains developed, we realized that we could magnify the force of our blows with the use of weapons. Rocks, sticks, clubs. These contact weapons took a street fight to the next level. Death, or at least a maiming blow, was to be expected. The stakes had been raised, the squeeze becoming harder. So the man who waded into combat was a man who was willing to play for high stakes, the ultimate stake. This was a man to be feared. Previous to weapons, the risk to engaging in combat was primarily loss of possessions, which could of course be reclaimed. But now it was death. The mere threat of combat was enough to make the lesser man retreat, without combat being required. In the brilliant opening to Stanley Kubrick's 2001, you see this scenario played out. The final ape engagement was between the two leaders of the clans, one armed, the other not. These two fought it out, and the unarmed proto-human clubbed to death. His compatriots fled, having never engaged in combat. The center of gravity, on both sides, was the leader. In his death, despite only constituting 10% of the combat power of the clan, was victory. The victory earned primarily through the psychological impact of the outcome of single combat, causing the weaker clan to retreat from the perceived stronger one. I open with this not because I love Stanley Kubrick movies, though I do, but rather because this dynamic at the small unit level is unchanged even today, and that all ground combat ultimately distills to a resolute man willing to face his enemy and close with him, and that, in 90% of cases, there is a psychological win prior to mortal combat, which causes the less prepared, less trained, less aggressive, the poorly led, to flee the battlefield or attempt to surrender, which can initiate the rout, which can win a battle and maybe even a war. It is only within this context that the seemingly inconceivable actions in battle, when viewed with a civilized but uneducated eye, can be understood. How in World War I, men were ordered to charge into machine guns and were cut down in the hundreds of thousands. Why in the age of nuclear weapons, we still issue and mount bayonets. How a single man, his voice rising above the indescribably loud din of battle, can lead his units against a seemingly insurmountable defense and carry the day when by all dispassionate analysis they should lose. And if you can convince your enemy that you are that man, that you can win any fight, that you are willing to bet it all for victory, then you can win without ever swinging a fist or firing a shot. It is this perception that is the strongest weapon of all. I invite you to watch 2 boxing matches. I promise they won't take long. Sonny Liston versus Floyd Patterson, and Mike Tyson versus Michael Spinks. Spinks and Patterson were champions. Both men entered the ring having already lost the fight. The look in their eyes and refusal to face their opponent demonstrated that these champions had surrendered before the first punch was thrown. While Tyson is remembered by even casual fans today, Sonny Liston was a terrifying man whose psychological dominance was probably the greatest in boxing history. Intimidation, bluster, and bluff more often wins a battle than the actual clash of arms. You will find I often come back to boxing. I took a lot of classes in over 25 years, teaching me fighting and war. But the single most important one I ever took to forge me into a combat leader was plebe boxing my freshman year at West Point. It taught me how to think while in pain and in fear, that you can't just run away. You have to stand and fight, and even against the better opponent, keep swinging till you can't swing anymore. Exhaustion, pain, and fear are feelings and emotions that are ubiquitous in combat, and no better education for war can be found than inside the ring, with an evenly matched opponent serving as the ultimate teacher. So, you'll forgive me if in sharing my education with you, I return time and again to where I first learned what Patton called the sting of battle. There is a quote attributed to antiquity and Heraclitus, but most certainly a modern construct. Out of every 100 men, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are just targets. 9 are the real fighters, and we are lucky to have them, for they make the battle. But the one is a warrior, and he will bring the others back. Sounds good, kind of makes the point. But Heraclitus did say, or at least someone 2,500 years ago said he did, give me one man from among 10,000 if he is the best. But do we now discount all of Clausewitz and his demand of mass if all we need is one resolute warrior? Of course not. The power of this apex warrior is removed if his threat to come to blows can be dissolved. For as soon as the weaker man faces this threat, he will devise means to keep him, literally, at arm's length. Thus was born the concept of standoff. If I can harm my enemy while I remain unscathed, in a million battles I shall remain undefeated. The first standoff weapon was probably a fire-hardened pointy stick, used to thrust at an enemy to keep him, again, at arm's length. But still a contact weapon. A weapon that, if imperfectly wielded, could, of course, be parried, and the unarmed man still winning the day. Not long after, I am sure, our indescribable ancestor probably threw it, thus extending the range, but expending his ammunition. Rocks as well. And here we have the creation of fires, the ability to project power beyond contact distance, and extending the field of battle beyond that of hand-to-hand, and now to the range of the weapon. Both contact weapons, spears and fire weapons, javelins, seek to expand the standoff distance. He with the longest spear or pike has an inherent advantage in close combat, provided he can wield it effectively. Intuitively, there comes a limit of how long a spear can be before becoming ultimately unwieldy. The famous Greek phalanx built around shields and spears ultimately ended with the Macedonian phalanx, with pikes nearly 20 feet long. A quick definitional clarification going forward. A pike is made to be wielded and thrust. A javelin is meant to be thrown. A spear can do either, and if made for both purposes, will prove to be inferior to the specialized weapon. General-purpose weapons being inferior to specialized weapons is a concept that continues to this day, as they inherently require compromise and capability, and that compromise can get you killed. There is a perception that fires are cowardly in comparison to contact weapons, and this is correct, but they are effective, and effective to the point that the use of fires is nearly universal in combat today. But firing small arms, pistols and rifles, at point-blank range where you almost cannot miss, say within 10 feet, makes them contact weapons in spirit, if not in physical actuality. It is not the bayonet that is scary. It is the man who wields it with determination that inspires fear. This psychological aspect of battle and the close combat fight is reflected both in the mission of the infantry, to close with the enemy by means of fire and maneuver in order to destroy or capture him, as well as the fifth stanza of the Ranger Creed, energetically will I meet the enemy of my country. Much of the light infantry combat I experienced in Afghanistan consisted of what I call the optional fight, an exchange of fire at distances greater than 100 yards, where either side could break off the engagement and avoid casualties, which is usually what happened as soon as one side or the other gained fire superiority, usually mine. But then you had the mandatory fight, within 50 yards or so. In this fight, someone was going to win and someone was going to die. And the better fighter wanted to get to that point in the ring of battle where there is no escape, to finish the fight in the metaphorical contact range of weaponry. So you have an irony that, technologically speaking, you want more and more standoff, while at the same time, psychologically, you want to get as close to the enemy as possible for the definitive fight. This goes back to our paradoxical trinity, only now at the tactical level. The raw emotion of ultimate competition, seasoned liberally with hate and fear, leaning heavily against the cool analysis of standoff engagements and risk-free killing. The quest for standoff as far as contact weapons ended with the pike and its multi-purpose brother, the bayonet. Infantrymen wielding pikes lasted well into the age of firearms. As a defensive weapon against horse-mounted cavalry, they were amazingly effective, the cavalry being armed with their own contact weapon, the lance. And while I wish to focus this episode on only fires and contact weapons and their influence in the infantry fight, I cannot continue without a discussion of the third leg of the combat arms, cavalry. You have the contact arm of infantry. You have the firearm of artillery. And then you have the horse-mounted arm of cavalry. While all types of cavalry until the 20th century used horses, there were two distinct types of cavalry, light and heavy, which were used for entirely different purposes and demanded different weapons, horses, and very different types of men. Light cavalry used the mobility of the horse to conduct reconnaissance and to act as an economy of force guard on the flanks, capable of seeing an enemy and perhaps defeating the enemy's own cavalry scouts. The counter-reconnaissance fight, which goes on today. Here, cavalry relied on the speed and endurance of the horse to expand their mobility and range, extending the eyes of the commander and dissipating the fog of war, and then to be used as weapons of pursuit against a broken enemy fleeing the battle. It was not to be used against formations of infantry. Then you had the heavy cavalry, whose use was to multiply the force of the lance or spear with the speed and size of the horse, and crash into the enemy's forces and break them apart with a lawn and shock effect. A terrifying vision whose impact has been replicated on screen to varying effectiveness. Braveheart has a good example both of the cavalry charge and resolute pike-bearing infantrymen standing steadfast against it. Against ill-disciplined, poorly trained, and poorly led infantry, a heavy cavalry charge was unstoppable. But it doesn't take a genius to realize that running away on foot from cavalry is a fool's errand. So provided the defense was good enough, far better to stand fast with proper weapons such as pikes, and the purpose-built anti-cavalry version, the halberd. But the large horse, riding at top speed, even though impaled by a mortal blow, would still crash through the first few ranks of infantry, the physical shock of mass and acceleration creating an unstoppable force. Waves upon waves of heavy cavalry battering down the ranks of the infantry armed with pikes could prove decisive. Contact weapons alone could not always stop heavy cavalry. But if you could kill the horse or rider, or wound him to ineffectiveness prior to this crash of horse and man, then you could weaken this force to the culminating point even before they met. And thus, ranged weapons, which thrown, slung, fired, or hurled a distance through some combination of leverage, tension, or chemical reaction, were introduced nearly as quickly as horses were tamed. Or, as these standoff weapons are known today, fires. This is not to say that cavalry alone was the impetus for fires. However, the speed of the cavalry created space on the battlefield, which unquestionably shaped the progression of fires, demanding more powerful, faster shooting, and longer distance weapons, which, I promise, will be discussed in more detail next week when we finally close our 4-episode overview of ground combat and land warfare. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.